Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We received many requests for interviews to clarify Russia's position, but since I will only be staying for limited time this year at the UN General Assembly, I hope this format of our interaction is okay with you. The UN GA session is taking place in against backdrop of a very difficult global situation. We're witnessing a number of systemic issues, and it is very important to resolve these systemic, both natural and artificially created issues. They should be on the forefront of our discussions. I'm referring to fight against terrorism. We need to fight symptoms of this scourge, but at the same time we should not neglect the root causes of the phenomena, the actions that oftentimes taken in good faith, but in reality aggravate the terrorist threat. Likewise, we can not limit our struggle to symptoms when dealing with issues on the European continent, including Ukrainian crisis. The crisis of the overall European security system emerged not as a result of the Ukrainian crisis, quite to the contrary. Ukrainian crisis is the reflection of the long-standing controversy that's been accumulated in the European politics when, after the end of the Cold War, we proved high-pitched declarations claiming that security should be indivisible and equal for all in Europe, but these were only words. Nothing happened in practice. NATO continued moving its infrastructure eastwards, growing the alliance, and as a result, solemn promises to create indivisible security as foundation of European security remain on paper, words only. We're concerned with these and many other matters. It's important that when we deal with each and every specific issues, we understand root causes of the problem. Otherwise, we will have to deal with this lack of common approaches to systemic issues that the global community is facing. We have many like-minded countries that advocate similar approach to the work of the United Nations, the General Assembly. Our proposal was well received, proposal made at the Security Council chaired by President Obama, when adopting resolutions similar to 2070-2078, we should engage, represent prominent members, all stakeholders, members of G8 Security Council and countries of the region, to engage in deep systemic analysis of root causes that led to and continue fueling international terrorism, because this is a shared threat to us all. Such discussion, in my view, would be very useful. The United Nations has already put in place a number of formats to combat terrorism, and we need to use them wisely and actively. I would also like to mention situation in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, Libya. We're seeing problems multiplied in the Middle East and the north of Africa. In addition to the general task to combat terrorist threat, we need to decide on how we could promote peaceful political settlement processes. Afghanistan, let us not forget about Afghanistan. When domestic issues, domestic public life arrangements should be decided on the basis of a broad national dialogue engaging all political, ethnic and other minority groups without attempts to impose settlement scenarios from the outside. and offer these ready-made solutions to certain countries. We've seen many examples, I don't want to list them, when attempts to settle a crisis at one country's own discretion, ignoring completely the real situation within a country, failed to achieve lasting solution of existing problems. In conclusion, I can't but mention Ebola virus. It is an issue that should unite us all in struggle, and we actively endorse the proposal of the UN Secretary General on the global community's response to the threat. Russia will contribute actively to the overall effort of the international community. We already sent assistance and medical staff to Guinea and will be prepared to do the same for Sierra Leone. When speaking at the GA meeting, the Secretary General 3 days ago called upon full compliance with the UN Charter principles. This is self-evident truth. These principles should be respected. And in that case, it makes perfect sense to reiterate our commitment. I'm ready to take your questions now. Al Hayat, over to you.
Just because of the tradition, if you don't mind, I will cease for the President of UNCA, and then I'll take the second question. Thank you very much, Maria.
Thank you very much, Ragida. On behalf of the UN Correspondents Association, welcome and thank you for the briefing. I'm Pamela Falk from CBS News. My question is, what does your country feel is Russia's role in the coalition to fight ISIS, and are Syria strikes legal? And what was your President's view of President Obama's singling out Russia on Ukraine? Thank you.
Что касается коалиции, то...
As regards coalition, the way you formulate your question is as though we're part of it. You asked, what's the role of Russia in the coalition that is being created? We are fighting against terrorism consistently, constantly, not just when someone announces a coalition. It's not some pop-up idea for us as regards specific threat emanating from Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and other radical groups, terrorist and extremist groups. We actively support countries in the region that are facing the threat, and we've been doing so for a long time. We've been doing it consistently. That relates to supply of armaments to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Egypt, and other countries of the region, and we're convinced that we should all strengthen the ability of these countries to oppose threat to their security, including terrorist threats. So we welcomed the fact that of late special attention has been given to the need to combat terrorism and step up counter-terrorist effort. We believe that any action taken globally, including use of force to overcome terrorist threat, should be done in accordance with international law and with a code of countries on treachery of which operations take place. I don't think anyone could argue that. And it's very important that such cooperation with Syrian authorities is established, even now that it's an accomplished fact, because excluding Syrian authorities from struggle that is taking place, from effort that is taking place on their treachery, not only goes against international law, but undermines efficiency of the effort. Let us not repeat the mistakes that were made when we tried to convene an international conference on Syria, where for ideological reasons Iran was not invited. Does that help it? No, I don't think so. So both in terms of international law, in terms of common sense, for pragmatic reasons, we should be inclusive. And all stakeholders that could potentially contribute to dealing with the matter should play on the same team. What about the third question? Oh yeah, President Obama said that Ebola fever is a more serious threat than Russian Federation, and he ranked terrorism third, if I'm not mistaken. So in his ranking of major threats went Ebola, Russia's aggression, and terrorist threat. I don't think this is really the way Russia is perceived by the global community.
You're aware, of course, that members of the coalition say that the roots of terrorism, because you mentioned the roots of terrorism in Syria, is due to the authorities in Damascus, the government of Syria is dealing with the first, it was an uprising actually. It's your ally. Are you willing to change course a little bit in order to make this fight against Daesh or ISIS a real solid one? Because I suppose you are against ISIS. Are you willing to be a little more political about it and just encourage your ally, Bashar al-Assad, to agree to the Geneva process, to do something? You do have influence with him. Can't you use this influence and then join the coalition possibly to really defeat the likes of Daesh, because you'd like to defeat them?
Что касается причин всплеска террористической угрозы,
as regards reasons, yes, Gita, I know that not just you personally, but many leaders speaking at the GA said that the terrorism threat is aggravating because Bashar al-Assad refuses to go. Well, it's a strong statement. We heard that statement many times from our partners. We also heard that it is precisely because Bashar al-Assad refuses to go that we're seeing problems in Iraq. I know history a little better. I remember what happened before the beginning of Arab Spring. I remember the year 2003, bombings, illegal bombings of Iraq, overthrow, coup d'etat, overthrow of regime that was tough but legitimate. I remember how Sunnis were forced to resign from all positions in the country, in the army, in the security service. So when talking about root causes of terrorist threats, we should remember what the situation was like in terms of terrorism, whether it was present or not, just 11 years back. Same in Libya. No one could ever imagine that one day large parts of the country would be seized by terrorist groups that create strongholds, that produce oil and sell oil. I don't see any link between that and the fact that Bashar al-Assad, like you said, refuses to comply with the Geneva statement. It was taken in June. Well, after it was adopted, Bashar al-Assad said that he was prepared to use it as basis for discussion, but the statement was turned down. We tried to prove it by the UN Security Council, and it was rejected. It only happened a year later when John Kerry and myself suggested to convene Geneva conference. So the first experience, the first meeting we had in Montreux, reaffirmed that all parties should abide by the Geneva statement. And the most important requirement in terms of political process is to ensure broad participation of Syrian stakeholders, political, ethnic, religious. So I don't think that national coalition we are in touch with. I don't think national coalition represents all of the Syrian society. There are national coordinating committees that are active in Syria and that are in opposition, strong opposition to the regime. There are other organizations such as Kurds organizations and others that never authorized national committee to represent them. Some people are represented, but opposition participation is not inclusive, and our American partners reaffirm that when we remind them that political process should continue. We need to start serious discussion.
More than 50 countries were invited to Montreal conference, which slowly shifted into the format of the United Nations General Assembly, where each state declared its position. So we need to ensure the holistic approach and avoid cases when some countries take their position of principle to look better in the eyes of their electorate. We need to establish a compact group with the participation of main opposition groups, the government of Syria and the governments of the region, including Iran. All countries of the region must participate. It's not the issue of Bashar Assad. Since the inclusiveness of the opposition was not ensured, the external participants did not attend, because without Iran's participation, this process will not be meaningful. So we shouldn't blame only someone selected as a main target. A person which is to be blamed for everything. There was some previous incidents, for example, in Yugoslavia, when, for the sake of overthrowing the so-called authoritarian leader, the entire statehood was destroyed. When the force was used in Europe, from the part of one OSCE member against another OSCE members, violating all Helsinki principles. For the sake of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, the entire country was destroyed. Now efforts should be made to restore territorial integrity and manageability of the country, taking into account the interests of Shiites, Sunnis and Kurds. So I call on everyone not to be tempted by simplistic decisions, thinking that if Bashar is ousted, everything will go perfect. This is not the case. We must deal with it professionally, sparing no time, despite our sympathy and the lack of sympathy when someone doesn't want to sit at the same table of negotiation with each other. It's a problem of capital.
Thank you, Mr. Lavrov. Would you please articulate and specify how is Russia participating in the fight against terrorism? I should say my name is Ali Barada. I belong to France 24 and An-Nahar newspaper in Lebanon. Can you please tell us how is Russia participating in this fight against terrorism in Iraq, in Syria, and in Lebanon? Be specific, if you please. Thank you.
Я уже сказал, что мы помогаем этим
I already said that we are assisting these countries in ensuring their security by supplying necessary military weapons and equipment. For many countries, we have trained specialists and professional specialists, and they intend to expand this work. We've acquired sufficient experience. We established contacts through special services, but for the well-known reasons I will not dwell in detail on that. The counter-terror activities include also the channels of special services and intelligence. And I can reassure you that everything works perfect in this regard.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Welcome back. Evelyn Leopold. On Ukraine, how do you see this ending? I mean, how do you see the future of it? The government has offered autonomy. The separatists say that's not enough. Do you see a Moldova type of situation of something sliced off on the east part of Ukraine, but really not part of Ukraine?
Эвелин, я бы предложил не ориентироваться на то, что говорят стороны переговоров. Еще совсем недавно они говорили, что они вообще вместе за одним столом не будут находиться, потому что правительство называло представителей Донецка и Луганска террористами.
I will not comment on what the parties say at the tables of negotiation. They said that they have nothing to exchange between the terrorists, and despite all those extreme positions, which are expressed in light of the public opinion, the parties were able to meet in Minsk, both the representative of President Poroshenko and the leaders of self-declared republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, with the support of Russia and OSCE. They were able to consolidate two documents, such as a roadmap, as a framework document, and the second document was a memorandum signed on the 19th of September, which emphasizes specific steps to be made to ensure long-term ceasefire, separation of fighting forces, removal of equipment, deployment of OSCE observers, etc. Everything which I said has been already implemented in practical terms. Within the Minsk procedure, the parties agreed to apply the same provisions to the protocol signed on the 25th of September. No one rejects this, and whatever is declared in Kyiv or Donetsk or Lugansk, they are consolidating their positions, and everything which depends on continuation of such negotiations and their success will be done by the Russian side.
Thank you very much. Minister, President Putin is threatening, according to the Financial Times, appropriate and immediate retaliatory measures against Ukraine if the pact with the European Union is not renegotiated or reopened, as it put it. What are those measures that you're considering? And the other part of my question is, does Russia consider the current government in Kiev to be a legitimate government?
Мы ведем разговоры с избранным президентом.
We maintain negotiations with a legitimately elected president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko. We maintain regular contacts at the level of ministers of economy, trade, energy, and other agencies. So there's no lack in channels of communication among the two sides. I don't know what the Financial Times published, but no retaliation measures against Ukraine or no measures to subvert or undermine the Ukrainian economy have not been intended nor declared, and there's no intent to apply such measures. Let me emphasize that then Ukraine was preparing to sign the association agreement with the EU. We draw the attention of our partners in Brussels and Kyiv that Ukraine has some other commitments within the Commonwealth of Independent States. That is another economic area. And the commitments on the free trade area that Ukraine was going to undertake counter the regime that Ukraine endorsed in the framework of the free trade area of the CIS countries. This is an obvious thing. And it was stated that first, excuse me, I must recall that the decision of President Yanukovych in November last year to postpone the application of the agreement with the European Union and analyze again this document was served the reason for the Maidan and the overthrow of government. Now they say that he disrespected the European norms. The reason was not the decision to annul or cancel, but to postpone the introduction of this agreement. Someone was intending to ensure the full success of the summit between Ukraine and EU. But what led to a total collapse of the entire country, making someone an hostage of one's own ambitions, declaring throughout the world that we were successful in ensuring the accession of Ukraine to the European Union, is irresponsible. We recall the proposal to hold special consultations between the EU and Russia and Ukraine, and to make it in such a way as to establish a sequence of specific steps allowing Ukraine to continue its operation in the free trade area of CIS and to agree on its functions in the European Free Economic Zone. EU stated that Russia should not interfere and rejected the proposal to hold such consultations. But now we have started such consultations and Brussels showed its interests. Moreover, they agreed to postpone to start application of the articles of association agreement which affect the CIS free trade area agreements until the end of 2015. Let me also draw your attention to the fact that Yanukovych was overthrown because he decided to postpone the signing of the document. Poroshenko signed it. Ukraine has ratified it, but the application of the very same articles that raise concern of Russia were postponed to 1 year in time. That was done to find the way out and harmonize the positions and the interests of all participants of this process. That means that we turn back to the situation which started the overthrow, actually. They decided to postpone the articles which affect the interests of the CIS countries. The difference is just measured in thousands of human lives, in destruction of infrastructure and enterprises. What was the reason for that? Nobody knows. As to Russia's response, retaliatory measures, we never say that we will punish anyone. But if Ukraine joins the free trade area with the EU in its full scope, then Russia will have to abandon the zero tariff rates for Ukrainian export to the Russian Federation and will go back to the most favored nation regime with Ukraine. Nothing more than that. Thank you, Georgia.
From our understanding, members of European Parliament entry into Russia. Can you confirm this?
Не знаю. А кто?
Sorry, no translation.
Если вы назовете фамилии, я постараюсь.
I don't know. I'm not aware. If you mention the names, I will investigate. Many Russian parliamentarians cannot enter the European Union, but I don't know whether Russia banned the entry of European deputies to Russia. We cannot leave untouched such an attitude from the EU. Microphone is not working. Please put on the microphone. I repeat once again. I'm not aware of the case you mentioned, but I don't see anything strange in that. Every country has the right, without explaining the reasons, refuse the entry to any citizen of another country. Whether it was linked with the sanctions against Russian deputies, that I'm not aware of. You are trying to take this specific issue, make a sensation out of it. The point is that until now, there were no shifts with the European Union in addressing and resolving the task of non-visa people movement across Europe, as announced by the OSCE. We will not go into specifics if we do not resolve general issues. Since 1995, the OSCE declared the principles of free movement of people. For 10 years, or more than a decade, we were preparing such a document on a visa-free travel. So how OSCE, the EU reverted on its position and decided not to offer a non-visa regime to Russian citizens for political reasons. We said that the Eastern Partnership countries will be the first to get visas, and the Russians will have to wait. Albeit everything was ready already, and the countries of the Eastern Partnership were not prepared to have such a regime. When I hear that someone was not let in a country or denied an entry, perhaps we would need to have a different kind of briefings. But if we are talking about politics, let us find, first of all, a common denominator on some general political issues. Associated Press. Masha, please don't discriminate against Russian press. And Georgia speaking Russian.
Thank you very much. Edith Lederer from the Associated Press, and welcome back to the United Nations, Mr. Foreign Minister. We miss you. First, as a follow-up to the question on Ukraine, could you tell us how close a real settlement is in Ukraine? And secondly, people are talking about a new Cold War now between the United States and Russia. In Russia's eyes, what needs to be done to improve relations with the United States to get them back on track and to the way they were in recent years?
Regarding your first question concerning Ukraine, I hope that the settlement process will become sustainable. It can be only gradual, sequential, and requiring appropriate assistance when all external stakeholders and players play the same key. Sometimes we have an impression that some members of Ukrainian government, especially Mr. Yatsenyuk, appointed Prime Minister by the Supreme Rada, does not support the steps leading to normalization of situation in the eastern Ukraine, and he takes a rather aggressive position, deny the non-bloc or non-alliance status of Ukraine, which doesn't help President Poroshenko in his efforts. We, in our contacts with our European and American colleagues, draw their attention on permanently and constantly that we must act constructively without instigating subversive acts against the peaceful process. As far as your second question is concerned, regarding the resumption or renewal of the Cold War, I spoke to many colleagues in this session and on the line of the General Assembly. I met with several regional groupings, Africa, Latin America, and others. And some colleagues told me But now they see clearly that the Cold War never stopped, and those who won the Cold War, and you remember the times when they declared that this is the end of history, they never abandoned the idea of using or employing the situation for their geopolitical interests, despite all declarations on equal rights, mutual taking of interests, indivisibility of security, etc., etc. What can be done to improve relations with the United States? I can say that we never tried to deteriorate these relations. We never did it, even at the times of the case of Magnitsky, or at the time when suddenly Edward Snowden showed up in the Russian territory, and Americans were vexed somehow by Russia, and even cancelled the visit of President Obama to Moscow on the eve of the G20 summit in St. Petersburg. We didn't deteriorate these relations. Russia did everything to maintain and preserve the context of communication. Much depends on on what atmosphere exists in the relations, does exist in the relations between Moscow and Washington. But there is a commission of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia and Secretary of State of U.S., which comprised 20 several different bodies, was annulled, not because of us. First of all, they cancelled one group on international.
They started with civil society group, then continued on with drugs and terrorist groups. So there are practical aspects, and Americans are ready to give up on practical cooperation in order to punish us. In that case, we don't really see the real need to take steps. We're prepared to work on the basis of equality, to work fairly. They tell us, let us agree on a set of criteria you'll comply with, and then we'll be lifting sanctions gradually. This doesn't sound serious to me, and I'm surprised that people that have track record in diplomacy can think of any such proposals. What we want is to work together with all those prepared to do so on the basis of equality, taking on board each other's interests. As soon as our partners are ready, they're welcome.
To Errol Avdokovich, and the next question goes to our Georgian friends. Please, Errol.
Mike, please.
Is this okay? Working? All welcome. That's what I mentioned. My question is, your President Putin is scheduled to go to Belgrade next month, between 16th or 20th. What would be the purpose of his visiting Belgrade? Serbia, as you know, is about to sign or to be a member of that European Pact, I would say like that. And also, what is your view of the prospects of Montenegro, Macedonia, and especially Bosnia and Herzegovina becoming member of NATO? Thank you.
Насчет визита президента Путина.
Well, the visit of President Putin is time to coincide with the 70th anniversary of freeing of Belgrade from Nazism. We cherish the memory of our victory and the war, value our allies, and President's visit is scheduled to take place to coincide with the celebrations that will be taking place in the capital of your country. With a large package of projects, cooperation, investment in Serbia, we have enough to discuss. We could think of additional ways to further strengthen and deepen our cooperation. As regards cooperation between Serbia and the European Union, well, we believe that Serbia should find such an arrangement with Brussels that will not damage our cooperation in the field of trade, commerce, and investment. This is what we're hearing from our Serbian partners. We've established good dialogue, and at least at that stage, we haven't had any issues. As regards expansion of NATO, in my view, it is a mistake, a provocation in a certain sense, an irresponsible policy in some ways that undermines commitment to build a system of equal and divisible security in Europe, equal for all, irrespective of whether a country is member of this or that bloc or not. After the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist, there were some radical voices in Europe that suggested, if not to dissolve NATO, and at least to shift the responsibility for upholding security in Europe to the OSCE. Then the situation would be completely different. The structure would be completely different because all would be equal partners of legally binding arrangements dealing with security. But a different path was chosen. Promises to limit the spread of NATO or not to deploy military infrastructure in new members were ignored. And this is one of the big problems of today, alongside with our inability to collectively analyze systemic problems that are present today. The international community seems to be inclined to focus on certain symptoms. Georgian TV, I'll continue in NATO topic. What do you think about possibility of Georgia becoming NATO member? Mike, please. Mike, please. Mike, please. Mike, please. Secretary General mentioned yesterday that Russia has a plan to crush and control its immediate members, and that for Russia, NATO is not a partner but a rival. Well, how would you respond to that? Well, Mr. Rasmussen made so many statements after it was announced that he's stepping down that I can no longer keep track of his statements. And when he says, he speaks not as a bureaucrat who runs NATO Secretariat, but rather as a prominent politician. So there's nothing I could add. As regards NATO expansion in general, well, I made my position very clear when responding to the previous question. I think it's a big mistake and failure to honor commitments that were made early 90s and later. Kommersant newspaper. France yesterday mentioned to limit the veto rate of the UN Security Council permanent members, saying that otherwise the body will be, would Russia be ready to give up its privileges to make Security Council operational? And second question, what would Russia's reaction be in case a U.S. operation in Syria and Iraq moves to its land phase? As regards veto rate, well, we're prepared to discuss it, but the debate will unlikely bring any result because the veto rate is enshrined in the charter of the organization. Changing the UN charter is, in my view, impossible for a number of reasons, not just because it's Russia's position. And second, if we imagine in theory that we start some sort of a debate or some search of a solution in line with this French proposal, it is unthinkable how that could work in practice. How do we put it on paper? Countries should voluntarily give up veto right in situations where international humanitarian law is violated, crimes against humanity, military crimes happen throughout the world. Who will decide on the level of sufferings of people? Who will measure the level of sufferings and draw the threshold where you abandon the veto right? What is it? One person, 100 people, 1,000 people? You remember this quote, one death is a tragedy, 100 deaths is statistics. So I cannot see that happening, whatever the motives for which France came up with the idea.
Stefano Vaccara, I'm with La Voce di New York and Radio Radicale in Rome. The European Union just changed the government, if you want to call it like this. Is that now that Italy is at the head, and the foreign minister of Italy, Mogherini, she will become next month the foreign minister of Europe. Before she was nominated, there was resistance in Europe because it was thought that she was going to be pro-Russian, and that they didn't trust her or didn't trust Italy in this. My question is, what do you expect Europe to do to resolve the situation with Russia in Ukraine? And if you met Minister Mogherini maybe here, and if you intend to maybe meet her because she's still here, and if you have any advice to Europe to what will be the first step to do in order to make the relation better between Europe and Russia. Thank you.
Постараюсь ответить.
I will try to answer you very briefly. As far as I understand your question,
Деятель, который считается пророссийским, не
a
имеет шанса сделать
pro-Russian
карьеру в Евросоюзе.
political figure has no chance to make a career in the European Union. But since Federica Mogherini was appointed, it means she cannot be called pro-Russian. Does that make sense?
Но это на самом деле тоже такое, понимаете, вот извращенное восприятие
But this,
происходящего.
again, is distorted perception of what's going on. We have many friends in Europe. Italy is one of them, just like France, Germany. There are many countries with which we enjoy good friendly relations. And blaming them, calling them pro-Russian, in my view, makes no sense. Unfortunately, it is very telling of the level of discussion in Europe and Brussels sometimes. There's no advice I could give to Federica. She is a person of great experience. She understands full well the interests of her country. At the moment, she is Minister of Foreign Affairs of Italy, and she is experienced enough to represent the interests of the European Union in general. I hope that these interests will not be substituted by interests of individuals that work in Brussels, in the headquarters of the European Union or the European Commission. That's a question that members of the European Union should deal with. Very often referred to European Union, but in reality we're dealing with the position of one European Commissioner or the European Council member. For instance, Great Britain, that raises a question. Or again, look at President Yanukovych, who postponed the signing of association agreement with the European Union, and he was overthrown, while Great Britain is thinking of changing its competences within the European Union, and that is taken with respect as something completely legitimate. So this is a European problem, no advice we could give. We can only reaffirm that we would like the European Union to find a solution to its issues. We want this organization to be united, speaking in the same voice, both internationally and global politics. We want it to remain our partner. We value greatly strategic partnership between Russia and the European Union. in line with agreements and accords we have. Trade volume is growing. We have a number of very promising joint projects, including projects in high tech. And I'm confident that it is in the interest of both Russia and European Union to lift all artificial barriers, alien barriers, to broadening our cooperation. As to what European foreign policy should do to contribute to the crisis settlement in Ukraine, well, not stand in the way, not interfere, and rather support arrangements that have been achieved with the help of European Union and such individual member states as France and Germany, European Union together with Russia, Ukraine, France in April signed a Geneva statement I referred to earlier, in which Kiev authorities promised to immediately start inclusive, accountable political process involving all stakeholders in order to amend constitution. That happened in April. But this word immediate should find some practical implementation. We suggested to approve it by the UN Security Council, but our European partners refused to do so. Therefore, not standard is the way is one thing, and then owner arrangements. That happened in April. We held 2 or 3 roundtable meetings, but they failed to meet the requirements of the Geneva Statement. Inclusiveness, engagement of all political stakeholders, but well, better late than never. From April to September, despite the opposition that was encouraged by some Western countries, Ukrainian stakeholders managed to come to a table of negotiations, and that resulted in Minsk arrangements everybody started to welcome. Before that, West just didn't want this dialogue to begin. They rather wanted to oppress with force those that tried to uphold the rights in the southeast of Ukraine. One more question.
Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coalition for Access, thanks for the briefing. I wanted to turn it. Thanks for the briefing. I wanted to turn it to ask you about Palestine and the conflict in Gaza, and whether you think there should be a role for the Quartet in that, whether the Security Council should have acted earlier or should act now, and also if you can say anything about the progress of the P5+1 on Iran. We hear a lot from the U.S. and sometimes from the EU, but what's Russia's view of how it's going and whether it will be concluded by November? Thanks.
Well, as regards Iran nuclear program talks, I remain cautiously optimistic. If we look at the drafting process of the text, we are very close to our goal, but there are sections remaining. You know, the devil that's in the detail, and these sections are the most complicated. And I have this feeling that all parties are interested in seeing productive resolution. We still have time until November 24. It's the deadline for negotiating teams, and we'll do our utmost to make sure that remaining small but extremely important issues be resolved in a way that would be acceptable to all. As regards Palestine, like I said, I'm convinced that the fact that it's been unresolved for many years is one of the most important factors that help extremists to recruit young ones and brainwash them, convinced that peace can never bring justice. Look, they promised us to create a viable state 70 years ago, and they cheated, and young people are very responsive, and we all know how they recruit newcomers to these extremist organizations. The quartet was a very useful format when it was invented, although in the past few years we suggested many times to expand membership and make sure that in addition to the UN, EU, US and Russia, bring on board the League of Arab States.
Контакты квартета с Лигой арабских государств заключались в том, что после того, как квартет провел свое заседание, принял какой-то документ,
the usual routine was for quartet after its meeting, after adoption of a statement, quartet members would invite representatives of the League of Arab States that were waiting at the door and just read out the statement to them. That is impolite. Not only so, it is counterproductive. The League of Arab States, well, it's not very homogeneous, there are diverging views, but if everyone thought alike, no one would need diplomats at all. So League of Arab States should be a party to the process. It's the author of the Arab Peace Initiative that was tabled by the king back in the days, endorsed by the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, representing over 50 states. So this Arab Peace Initiative, in my view, remains key to implementing decisions taken by the UN, the Madrid principles, and other relevant instruments. Quartet has not been convened for over 12 months now, for a long time. We knew that parties agreed to work through mediation of the United States, asked for a 9 months time in order to try and achieve results. Unfortunately, they failed. Then we tried to put the flames down in Gaza. Now, thanks to Egypt in the first place, we managed to achieve stable truce, knock on wood. And then, again, thanks to mediation efforts of Egypt, we managed to advance in rebuilding unity between Fatah and Hamas in Palestine. Without such unity, no negotiation would allow to achieve lasting solution to the Palestinian issue. We wanted to convene a quartet meeting on the sidelines of the UNGA this week. Some of our quartet partners said, well, we'll meet, but we will not be able to adopt any formal paper, and this meeting will be considered a failure. In my view, this is groundless. In the current situation, when so many things happen, so many developments took place, just having this four-party meeting, well, at best, invite representatives of the League of Arab States, just look each other in the eyes and compare notes. Not make it public, not invite any press, not make loud statements in the GA or Security Council, but just have a frank discussion of what happened and what could be done to try and help find a solution, way out of the stalemate. Well, they decided not to. Well, we'll continue. We'll continue working, not necessarily in the format of a quartet. If someone is not happy with the format any longer, for whatever reason, okay. But I think there is real need for a format that would encompass the League of Arab States.
Can you please comment on the persecution that the Muslim Tatars are facing in Crimea? Why are they being...
Speak louder.
Louder? Sorry. Can you please comment on the persecution that the Muslim Tatars are facing in Russia? Why they are being pushed out, and are there plans underway to deport them?
Could you repeat it louder, really louder?
On Crimea, the Muslim Tatars, can you comment on their persecution? why they are being persecuted against, and are there plans to have them deported similarly to the way Stalin deported them in 1944?
Я не могу вам ответить на этот вопрос конкретно,
I cannot give a specific answer to your question because I don't know what persons are you referring to. As far as the situation of the Crimean Tatars is concerned, they, as Russian citizens, enjoy the same treatment as any other Russian citizens. I never heard about any serious problems with Crimean Tatars. There are cases, however, when there are some indications of extremist engagement in extremist activities, and law enforcement was applied against such persons as in any part of Russian territory where we see the manifestation of extremism. No one is intending to deport anyone from Crimea, and I draw your attention to the point that after a referendum that took place in Crimea, and the prevailing majority of population in their free will expression made a decision that they took, decided as a first measure after acceding to Russia to introduce 3 official languages in Crimea: Ukrainian, Russian, and the Tatar language, which was never the case when, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Crimea turned out to be a territory of Ukraine. Ukraine declared an autonomy of Crimea, after which most of the privileges and rights enshrined in that constitutions were revoked by the Kiev authorities, and never over all those years the problem of illegal seizure of lands by Tatars coming from other countries was raised. The Tatars who came to Crimea simply took over the land because of the lack of housing and the lack of accommodation. The situation was quite fraught with the risk of explosion. After Crimea joined Russia, all those who took the land were received the amnesty, and we will defend the rights of Crimean Tatars and as all other peoples who live in Russia. This is our policy. Elections took place in Crimea recently to the legislative branch and the executive authorities. People who won the election are recognized by the entire population, and they are very responsible in their work. I think that Crimea will only gain after what it joined Russia. First channel. The question concerning the current events on the discovery of mass graves in the territory, on the sites of hostilities where the Ukrainian troops were deployed. Hundreds of dead have been discovered, mostly civilian, as was stated. It was said that the OSCE is ready to launch an independent investigation. Information was disseminated that the UN is also going to have such an investigation. Did you discuss this problem with your colleagues? Naturally, we discussed it with the Secretary General of the United Nations and Secretary General of OSCE and the Chairman of OSCE. The members of Special Monitoring Mission working in Ukraine visited at least a part of the sites that were discovered. I'm not sure they were able to visit all the sites of mass graves. They have an instruction from the organization to take into account the results of the investigation in their report. The recent report presented yesterday or day before yesterday in Vienna included already information on the visits to the grave sites, and it has been confirmed that these are civilians and they were killed or shoot at blank point range. We are very concerned with what had happened. We cannot accuse or blame anyone until the end of the investigation, but we will insist on carrying out this investigation, bearing in mind that it should be objective, independent, and that it should not repeat the cases of previous investigation when attempts were made not to hold accountable the culprits, such as the snipers at Maidan, or shooting down the Malaysian SIL airplane. Several commissions were established, and even the Council of Europe, for example, joined the Maidan investigation committee. No one showed up, actually, at this commission. So there were nobody was able to point a blaming finger at the Kievan strong arm authorities. Actually, national reconciliation is a key to the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis. Without establishing the truth, without the calming down the moods of the relatives, it is impossible to settle the situation. In our diplomatic work, we take into account not only the moral aspects of the strategy, but also pragmatic tasks. As we already agreed, this will be the last question. Please go ahead.
Mr. Lavrov, welcome back. And as always, you are a great and honorable leader. My question has to do with the military component of the association agreement, which President Yanukovych refused to sign. I studied that, I guess it was back in October and November, and the military aspect of that agreement would be tacitly including Ukraine in NATO. There would be military arrangements where Ukraine would be required to participate in NATO actions. Now, this would, it appear to be the completion of the encirclement of Russia by NATO bases. Can you comment upon this and why? Well, it was described as a military arrangement masquerading as an economic agreement. Can you comment upon this and whether this is being addressed in the discussions between your president and President Poroshenko and the EU?
I don't think that the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU contained provisions that would provide for Ukraine's participation in NATO. There is a military political section in that agreement which envisages the assistance of the EU to Ukraine in the area of armed forces and security forces, that the Ukraine should bring its legislation in line with the EU legislation on export control, on dual-purpose goods trade. But all that was in the context of the military context between the EU and the Ukraine. As far as NATO is concerned, Ukraine has adopted legislation providing for non-participation of Ukraine in any blocs. We believe that this is an essential component ensuring European security. I already said how we see the expansion of NATO, which we deem as a provocation and a necessary effort which maintains the dividing lines, moving them to the east,
and accompanying it with the deployment of military infrastructure on the borders of Russia. You asked about American bases. I read a joke in the internet when the map of the Russian Federation and the countries joining it are surrounded by dots or asterisks designating hundreds of American bases with a comment, Russia dared to move its territory to American bases. Will not tolerate any repetition of any arms race. When they say that the missile defense system is not against Russia, we'd like to argue that our military graduates from military academies understand the situation quite well, and they see how this is projected to Russia's capacity to ensure its own safety and security. When the NATO summit in Wales was prepared, representatives of the Baltic states and Poland actually pronounced their ideas aloud when they said that the missile defense system should ensure defense against Russia. So this mentality of Cold War doesn't leave the brains of our NATO partners somehow, but they understand perfectly well the attempts to impose the bloc status on Ukraine represents the most serious threat to the European stability. And what Mr. Yatsenyuk and other politicians in Kiev now say, demanding to change the non-bloc status of Ukraine and move along on the way of joining NATO, was done on someone's suggestion. I'm certain and know it for sure that when I talk to my colleagues from the prevailing majority of countries, including the West, the leaders of the West understand the unacceptability of such a stance from the view of establishing a common European security area. Thank you.